In this video, we'll cover everything there is to know about the Lumos framework for Webflow. Whether you're brand new to Lumos or you've been using it for a while, this video will be the go-to resource for everything related to Lumos. So let's get started. For our structure, we have a page wrap that holds all of the content on the page. This is useful for copying the content of an entire page from one page to another. It's also set to overflow clip so that if any elements hang off the edge of the screen, it doesn't cause horizontal scrolling. Now, inside of that, we have a custom code component that goes on every page of our site. In that component, we have the base embed with all of the base styles default to Lumos. And under that, we have a custom embed where we can write our own CSS that should apply to every page of the site. Under that, we have the fluid sizes component that holds all of the fluid sizes made by the Fluid Builder app, which we'll cover later. And under our custom code component, we have a grid guide component. This is just a position fixed div that holds a bunch of divs to act as our columns here. And this just helps us check to see how elements are aligning across multiple sections. This entire grid guide component automatically hides whenever we preview and whenever we publish our site. And if we need to, we can head into the component and turn off its visibility temporarily, and this would affect every page on the site where the component is used. So under that grid guide component is where we would place our nav bar. Lumos doesn't come with a nav by default, so you could create your own nav specific to your design, or you could head to the Lumos component library inside the Lumos Docs and copy any of the default Lumos nav bars from here as needed. Now, under that is where we have our page slot. This is tagged as main for SEO and screen readers. It has an ID of main, so we can anchor down to it if needed. And it has all of the sections used on our page. Now, we use a page slot so that the client can edit inside of it when in build mode. So when in build mode, the client can't delete or move anything that's outside of the page slot, but they can move around things that are inside the page slot, delete those elements if needed, and add new sections if needed. This wouldn't be possible if we were not using a page slot, so it's important to have that. Now, under that, we have our footer. And if we check this out, our page wrap here has a min height of 100 SVH. And that's so on larger screens, it's always at least as tall as the browser height. And it's set to flex. And that way we can set the page main here to grow if possible. If this was not set, the footer would just be floating up here instead of anchored down to the bottom of the whole screen. So the page main is set to grow if possible to keep that anchored down. This also page main is set to flex, so that way on certain pages where we only have a single section, like maybe a 404 page, and we want this section to fill all of the remaining space, all we had to do is set that section to fill all of its parent, and now it's centered within the remaining space minus the height of the nav and height of the footer. In Lumos, we have component classes and utility classes. Component classes have underscores instead of dashes, and they start with the name of the component, so we know this class can only be used in our footer component. Utilities have dashes, and they start with U for utility, so we know this class can be used anywhere throughout the site. Utility classes help us work faster. Instead of having to manually apply the H6 size, line height, and weight, we can just add on a class that has all of those styles. Utilities also keep our site code cleaner, because every time we click and apply a blue label, Webflow adds an extra line of CSS to our site, and it serves that CSS on every page, even pages that may not be using this class. So if we create one reusable utility for text align center and apply that everywhere we need that style, then we'll only have one line of CSS on our site for center alignment instead of recreating it each time we need it manually. Now, sometimes we'll need to override a utility style, and I'll show the wrong way to do that first, and that would be to add sort of a custom class on top of it. So maybe I add on a class to override this H6's text transform, maybe its color, and anything else like that. So one of the problems here is if I need to add another utility later on, like maybe a font weight of bold, well, now I have a utility sandwich with my custom style in the middle here. But a more serious problem is this footer title is a combo class of the H6. It only exists when it's on top of that H6. So if I need to switch this to an H5 font size instead, now I've lost all of my custom styles. If I add that same footer title class on, nothing happens because it only existed when it was on top the H6. So what we want to do instead is apply any custom styles to our component class here. This is where we might want to override our font color. This is where we might want to set our own text transform. And then from there, we can add a utility on top of that. And we can stack whichever utilities we need. But if we need to change the size to an H5 in the future, all of our custom styles are still in place. Now, the H6 class has its own light font weight applied, but if we were to apply a different font weight to our component class here, we'll notice this is going to override the H6 font weight. And when we click on this, it's saying that this weight is now coming from our component class, not from the H6 class. And the same thing would happen if we were to stack a utility like weight bold and then have the H6 class here. What we'll notice is the weight that we get is actually the weight bold class. And it doesn't matter which order we stack these. If we start with the H6 and then we add the bold class on top, we're still going to get the weight from that bold class here. And the reason is it doesn't matter the order these classes are stacked in. It just matters which class was created last in Webflow. So our utility classes were all some of the first classes created in our project. We might create a new utility like uWeight extra bold, and we might go ahead and apply that extra bold sort of weight to it. And what we'll notice if we create another class, and maybe I'll call this something like hero heading, what we'll notice if we apply a weight to this one, this class was created after the extra bold class was created. So even if I add that extra bold class on, the hero heading is still going to win out because it was created after the extra bold class was. Now, this is important if you ever add new utilities to your project later on. So if you have the FinSuite Chrome extension under CSS style reorder, you can reorder the utilities here. And it's important that utilities that have multiple styles, like this H1, H2, these have weights, these have line heights. We want those above utilities that only have single styles. Any single style utilities like weight, line height, text transform would be further down so that it can override the utilities that have multiple styles. And then underneath all of our utilities is where all of our component classes go, so that the component classes always override any of the utilities. In Lumos, every single element needs a component class, even if that class has no styles applied. If it has no styles, it won't show up at all in our site CSS, so we can create as many component classes as we'd like without adding a single new line of code to our site CSS, and the styles can come from reusable utilities. This helps with clear labels in the navigator. If you have ever tried to navigate a very large site that used only utilities, it can get easy to get lost fast. Now, this also helps if we need to apply a style later on. We already have the class there in case we need it to affect all these different elements. It also helps with interactions and functionality. If we were to try to target this H6 class either with Webflow interactions or custom code, if we change it to an H5 style later, our interaction would break. But if we target this component class that we know will never change, then we can change out the size freely later on without having to worry about anything breaking. This also helps prevent accidental changes. A client could easily apply maybe text align center here and affect all H6 headings throughout the site. But if we make sure we never use this utility directly, instead always stack it on top of component class, then when the client applies a style here, it's only affecting these group titles. It's not affecting other H6 elements throughout the site. And this also gives us global control because we can rename this class. It's not going to rename every H6 class. It's just renaming the class that was stacked on top of this title. So if I rename this to H5, notice how it's affected every text element that had an H6 class on top of the title. And it also kept any of our overrides in place. This text align, any text transform, or anything I have applied stays in place when I rename the class here. Now, sometimes we could run into issues where you'll notice it's saying this class name already exists. And if we run into that, we can just rename it to a class that does not exist, and then we can change it back to anything we want from there. Now we can also add any other utilities we want here, like this margin, and I can go ahead and rename this to maybe a smaller margin bottom one, and that's affected every single one of these elements here. Now, even though we can apply overrides here, it's best to try and apply any overrides to the base component class. We can always click here and get into it, but if you have the Lumos Chrome extension, a keyboard shortcut is the Shift key and the up arrow will take you right to that base class to apply any custom style, and Shift key and down arrow goes back to all classes. And on lower breakpoints, what it'll actually do is remove all of the stacked classes when I hit the Shift and up arrow, so I can quickly apply my style. And then when I hit Shift and down arrow, it'll reapply all of those stacked classes. Component classes are made up of three parts. We have the type of component. This is a button component. We have the variation. This is our play button, but we could have an arrow for sliders. We could have a main button or any different type. And then we have the element. This is the wrap or the start of the entire play button component. And we could have other elements belonging to that component, like the icon or anything else. So this creates a nice search system. So when we search for btn underscore, it shows all of the different button components, and then we can filter it down to a certain type, and then we see the elements belonging to that type of component. So we follow that same process for an entire section. So hero main, this is our main hero section, but we could have other types of heroes. And this is the wrap or the start of that component. And within that, we have the contain. And within that, we might have the layout. And within that, we might have the content. And if you're using the Lumos Chrome extension, if you hit the right arrow key, it'll return the class name of the parent. So all we had to do is type in our element name, like maybe this is our title belonging to our main hero component. Now, sometimes we'll need child components inside our main component. So this is our hero condensed section, and it has a link inside, but that link has other elements that belong to it. So we'll call this link underscore wrap. So this is a child component class. And we have some elements inside like link text, indicating this belongs to the link so that it doesn't conflict with the main text of our entire section. And we could have a link icon here, but this icon has other elements that belong to it. So we don't want to nest a child component inside of a child component. We wouldn't call this link icon wrap because we should never have more than 3 underscores, and this puts us at 4. Instead, we just want to nest this child component directly into the entire section. Now the section already has an icon sort of child component, so we just need to name this something different, like maybe button or SVG, and this is the wrap of our new child component, and then we can have other children inside that belong to this component here. Now we can also have global components, and we indicate those with G underscore. This is a component that can be used inside any section on our site. It's different from a utility because it has multiple elements that belong to this, making up a component. And we often turn this into an actual component element. That way, when we search for global, it will show all of our different global components that can be used inside any different section on our site. The last type of class we have is a combo class. And to make a combo class, we just create it on top of an existing class. Combo classes start with is dash. I'll call this one is active. And we can go ahead and change maybe the color here. And we can apply this class with JavaScript on hover, click, or scroll to affect the style of that element there. Now, combo classes only exist on top of the class they were created on. So if I try to apply isActive here, notice it can't even find that class because it only exists when it was on top of the other class. Utilities are different because we first create them not on top of another class so that they can be used anywhere on any element. But combo classes are specific to the element they were created on. So if I create isActive here on top of this link text, it's going to have a totally different style than isActive on top of the title element because it's a different class. It only exists when it's on top this base class. Now, we shouldn't apply combo classes or create them on top of utilities. They should always be created on top of the base component class instead. But we can still keep our utilities on here, and when we toggle that isActive class with JavaScript, it's still going to have the right style. We just want to make sure that that class was created and defined initially on top of the component class. Now, to manage color in Lumos, under our variables in our default collection, we have our core swatches. This is pretty simple by default, but we can make it as robust or as minimal as we need. Many amazing sites are built with only 2 swatches and no sort of variations, so it really just depends on what your design system calls for. If our design calls for 2 shades of a dark color, we could create another one called dark secondary and go ahead and tweak that color, add it in, and we're only adding what we need, nothing more and nothing less. And often in software and app products, we'll have numbered sort of colors, with the darker ones being the higher number. So if you have many different shades of a color, it's not a bad system to go with. And it doesn't have to be so limited to only neutrals. Often websites use colors in more creative ways. So our darks might be shades of green, and maybe our lights could be shades of a light blue. So it really just depends on what your design needs and calls for. So I'll go ahead and add in this light color here. And something else that we'll often do is have sort of opacities of colors. Now here I have a dark faded, that's my dark color at a 10% opacity. If we had multiple different opacities we're using throughout our site, we could create an opacity 10, another for opacity 20, and any others we need. So it really just depends on how complex your design system is. Now, here we also have our brand color, and whenever we use this as a background color, we'll have dark text on top of it. So we have a brand text variable here. And that's so if a client ever goes through a rebrand and they change their brand to something darker here, we could switch this out to light text, and it would update everywhere that combo is used throughout the site to make sure we have good contrast there. Now, you might also have multiple different brand colors. We could add that in as well and create a system based off what we need. Now, inside themes here, we have our light mode and our dark mode. And we want this base mode to be whatever our primary color is. So if our site is mainly a dark mode site, we would set this base mode to be all of the dark mode variables. And that's because Webflow applies this base mode on the HTML element, but they don't let us swap out the mode on the HTML element, only on the body. So you'll mainly notice this on iPhones. If you scroll up too high, the HTML color might not match the body color, or underneath the iOS nav, it might look different if this base mode isn't set to the primary color of your site. Now, we can also choose to build this out more. So maybe we have multiple different background colors that all pretty much look like light mode, but one's white, another's a light blue. So if that background color doesn't need to change the color of any children, like buttons or links or cards, then I would recommend just adding this background color directly within the existing light mode. If it does need to change the color of children, then we would create a whole new mode for it. But as much as possible, it's nice to try and keep this all within the existing light mode if we can. So I'll go ahead and set this background secondary variable we just created to be this light blue color, like so. And if we didn't have another background color for our dark mode, we could just leave this set to the main dark. In this case, we do though, so I'll create another secondary background inside of our dark mode as well. And we could also have a text secondary if we need another like accent color for text. We could have a border secondary if we want like solid borders, or maybe our solid border inside dark mode is like the brand color, and inside light mode, it's just still dark. So we have control over what happens between all those modes. Now we also have our button primary here. This is our solid button. It has a brand background and border with brand text for its text. And when we hover it, the background changes to dark, border changes to dark, and text color changes to light. And then we have our button secondary. This is our outline button. It has a transparent background with a faded border and dark text. And when we hover it, the background and border changes to dark with light text here. And we can add other colors for folders for things like the tertiary sort of button. If we have like a ghosted style or a faded background we need, we could also have a folder for an element like a nav link or different links throughout our site. Maybe we have its text color, but maybe its active color is different. So we could have text active to indicate when we're on the page, and maybe a text hover for when we're hovering that link. And if that nav link also has a border, we could do the same thing for border active, border hover, and create any variables we need. We could create a folder for a card, and we could have a card shadow hover. So we just create the variables based on what our design needs here. Now, we might also have a brand mode, and I'll go ahead and name that here. So we have it. If we have a section that should fill the entire background color of the section with this brand, we would set that here. And this might not have a secondary background color inside brand mode. That's totally okay. Its text color might be the brand text. Its border might be a faded version of brand text, or it might be the actual brand text, either way. And then this primary button can't be brand anymore when it's on a brand background. So its background might be brand text. So it's just whatever the opposite of the brand color is. And then its text color might match that background here inside this mode. So we can really just build this system out to whatever we need it to be. Now, we don't apply this button primary and button secondary styles directly to our button. Instead, we have a mode switcher for our button styles. This is especially helpful when you have multiple different styles, like more than 2 of your buttons, or if we're applying different things like icons that need to change inside the button and things like that. It's helpful to just have a mode to switch this. So for our base, our solid button, the background here is just set to button primary background, and that'll dynamically switch between light and dark based on the themes inside here. The border is just button primary border. The border hover is the same thing. And then for the outlines button, we just connect it all to the outline styles here. And this just makes it much easier, especially when you're dealing with many different buttons throughout your site. So just to show that in action, if we were to create a new button from scratch, I'll go ahead and add in sort of just a div here, and we'll call this our BTN. We'll call this arrow if we have a slider arrow, and this is the wrap, and we'll give it a width of 1.5 rem. We'll give it an aspect ratio of square, so maybe this is a perfect circle. We usually either want to do inline flex or inline block, either way. I'll go ahead and align the children here to the center. Might increase the width a little bit. We'll do 2 rem. And inside this, I'll go ahead and drop in sort of like an arrow icon into that. And I'll go ahead and just wrap this arrow icon in a div. And we'll go ahead and let's add in that div. We'll call this our arrow SVG. And let's give it a width of 50% of its parent. We'll go ahead and put the icon into that like so. So that way we can really just control it. I might back down the size a little bit more. And let's go ahead and set the whole arrow wrap to be a background color of our button style. So we're not actually grabbing the primary or secondary variables. We're reaching for this button style background color. And then we want to make sure to give it a border in case we ever need an outline button. So I'll apply my border width here, and the border color will be the button style border color. The text color can be button style text color. And I'd usually apply a transition to the background color and the font color and border individually. And if we're not using a JavaScript animation for that anyway. And then on hover, we'd switch this over to be the border hover. Background would be background hover. And then the text color would be text hover, like so. And once we have that set, we might also decide to have a border radius on this, or we might not, just really depends. In this case, I'll do a very small radius. So this one's more of a square button like so. And now we can go ahead and turn this into a component. So I'll put this in my button folder, and this will be my arrow button, and I'll create that like so. And we'll go ahead and add in a secondary variant for it. And this base one will be our primary variant. And what's great is when it comes time to apply that secondary variant, all we had to do is switch the theme or the mode for that button like so, and it'll switch everything over that we need. Any children that were applied, we don't have to go attach variants to each individual child. It just switched the mode of the whole button. And something else we might want to do is be able to switch the background color of the section to be our secondary background color. So one way we could do that is with a utility. I could create a utility like background secondary, and I could use that to apply kind of my secondary background color here. So if we go into theme, our theme folder, and we go background secondary, and now if we want to be able to turn that on and off per component, we could, one way is attach a class attribute here. And we could choose to attach background, background secondary. And we could do primary or secondary either way. And I could link that up to a component field called class. And so now on this whole component, I can either delete that class or I can add it in if I want that secondary background. Or if you don't want to use the class attribute and you want to use variants instead, another way is to actually have a child div for the background color. So we could have a global sort of background. So this is a global background component, and I might give it a position absolute utility so it covers its whole parent like so. And on that component, I'll go ahead and turn that into a component we can reuse. So I'll call this global background. And we'll go ahead and put that inside the global folder so we can reuse it across multiple sections. And we'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and remove this absolute utility for a second. So we'll set a couple variants. Maybe the default variant is transparent in case we have some sort of shape or thing across the whole page that we want to see underneath this section. And then we could have another variant that applies our primary background color, and we could have another one that applies the secondary background color. And I'll call this first one transparent. So on the transparent variant, we just leave that transparent color. On the primary variant, we set the theme background primary. And on the secondary variant, we set that sort of theme background secondary. And then what we can do is go ahead and name this prop background, or background color even. And let's go ahead and add that absolute utility back one. So now that we have that set, now we have this child component where we can switch out what we want the color to be, like so. I'll go ahead and remove this class attribute from the section. We don't need that there. And I might go ahead and set the default prop to be the primary background color, like so. So we have that set. And so now what we can do is link this up to a field on the entire section. So we can call this, we'll put it in a folder of styles, and we'll call this background. And so now on this entire component, we're able to switch out the background color of this component. Now we still want to be able to switch between light mode, dark mode on the entire section. So on our base variant, we're not actually going to attach anything, but on this next variant, we'll call this light. We'll create another variant. We'll call this dark. And let's go ahead and create another variant called brand. And we'll name this base variant inherit. So on this inherit variant, what we would do normally is attach the theme background color, but since we're using a background component here, we're not actually going to do that. We will want to reapply the theme text color just so it's set on this element and it's not using the body's text color. Now, if we head over to the light variant, this is where we'll want to apply our light styles here. And then on the dark variant, this is where we'd want to apply the dark styles. And on the brand variant is where we want to apply the brand styles, like so. And so now this inherent variant is great. Let's go ahead and rename this to be, we'll call this our theme, and we'll put it inside of styles. So we'll say styles, theme, and we'll go ahead and add that in. And let's make sure that this will rename styles, the background color. Let's actually just ungroup it for a second. There we go. And that way we can group the background into styles like so. So I like to put the theme up at the top above the section padding, the background color under that. And so now if the theme is set to inherit, it'll just receive from whatever the theme of the whole body is. So if our whole body of this page happens to be in dark mode, then this section is dark because we didn't override the color of the section. But we might have other instances where we say we want the section to always be light, regardless of what the page color is, or always be dark, or always be brand. So we have that control there. And then we also have the control to control our primary or secondary background color. And that's going to automatically switch depending on the brand that we have that in, like so. So this gives us a good bit of control using variants. Now we can easily animate between Lumos color modes on scroll or hover with GSAP. We can also switch between modes with toggle switcher that remembers our settings between pages. And we can create automatic tints and shades from a single variable if needed, so that if we animate this variable, all the tints and shades are created in real time from this. And these tints and shades are just variables here that we can choose from and even use within gradients. So to check out any of these resources, head to the Lumos color docs to find them here. Now to set up our sizes and spacing, we'll start with our default variable collection, and we'll start with this site width. This is the max width of our site, the point at which everything should stop scaling up. Usually we want this to match the width of our original Figma design. This design was created at 1560 pixels wide. If we divide that by 16, that's 97.5 rem. So we'd set that as the value here for our site width. And sometimes you'll be given what the site looks like on a very wide screen. And in that case, it has all this extra space that we don't actually need. So we'd take the width of the content plus the width of any left and right space we plan to have here to keep the content off the edge. So this entire box is 1560 pixels wide, and that's what we'd use here. Now that left and right space here that keeps the content from the edge is called our site margin. And in this case, it's set to 56 pixels in Figma, but here in Webflow, it's set to 0 pixels because it's being overridden with custom code. It's a fluid value. So to edit that, we would go ahead and open the Fluid Builder app, and this is where we'd set that value here. So we'll be able to set what we want it to be on both desktop and mobile. And we'll want to edit that site margin variable. So if I look at site margin here on desktop, I'll set it to 56 pixels. On mobile, I'll set it to 18 pixels. And while we change these variables, notice how it updates in real time here. It's important to check this though from the actual site max width. That way we're seeing this variable at its full original size. And we also want to make sure this stops scaling up at a 1560 screen size so it matches our site width. These values are all in pixels here, but the app converts them over to rem. And here it's going to scale down to 18 pixels at a screen size of 320, like so. Now, if we go back to our variables, what we'll notice here is we also have this site gutter, and that's the space between each of the columns within our grid. Right now that's set to 1 rem. We could change that to anything we'd like and also make it fluid if we'd like. Our column count is how many columns our site is designed on. It could be designed on a 10 column grid, a 24 column grid, or anything else here. Our radius values here are set with rem, and we can add any extra ones we need. Our border width here, this is 1.5 pixels, but it's being set with rem so that when the user increases their font size, the border width also increases, because if this was set with pixels, the border width would start to look really tiny and not proportional to the other elements. So in Lumos, user font size should work just like browser zoom. When you zoom the browser, even pixels values increase, but with text zoom, it's different. Only rem values increase. So Lumos doesn't use any pixel values so that everything feels consistent even when the user increases their size. Now, if we head back over here, we'll also notice this focus outline, and that's used for whenever we tab onto a link. So notice when I tab onto this link here, it's focused. Normally for text links and even buttons, we want that focus outline to be outside of the element. And that way, if the button happens to match the color of the focus outline, we have a gap here that separates the elements like so. But whenever we're inside of maybe like an overflow scroll div here, what we'll notice is that focus outline starts to get cropped, which isn't quite what we want here. So we need to be able to switch the focus outline to be inside of the link sometimes when needed. Now on all links, that focus outline is set to go outside by default. All we need to do is switch this to our inner variable instead, and then it'll go right inside of the link for these like so, and nothing gets cropped. So to edit that, all we need to do is head over to our variables, and in our default collection, we have the focus outline width. And then for its offset, we just do that same value, but negative. So it pulls it in by the width of that. And then for the outer value, we can space this as far as we want and towards the outside of the element. Here we also have our container, small, main, and full. These values are being overridden with custom code, so what we set here doesn't really matter. We could set it to 0 pixels, but I like to leave a value in here because the component preview doesn't account for any custom code. So if we set that container width to 0, it would keep that 0 inside the preview. But those container values are all being overridden with custom code. And what we'll notice is that I'll head to a larger screen size here. The container main is just the main container we use throughout the site. The small one indents it by 1 column on each side. So if our site was designed on an 8-column grid or a 10-column grid, then this inner container would be 8 columns. We have our container full, and that goes pretty much to the edge of the screen minus the site margin, like so. And we also have utilities for these. So if we want to use a container small, we have that as a utility we could use. Or if we want to use container full, we can switch between those utilities as needed. Now, also inside our default variable collection, we have our size folder. And these sizes can be used for padding, they can be used for font sizes, icon widths, general spacing, really anything throughout the site that we want to be fluid. And all of these size variables are made fluid by default inside of the Fluid Builder. We'll notice the sizes are more extreme here on desktop, and they really start to level out more here on mobile. And we can really apply these to anything. So if we open up our spacing folder, here we have some general spacing for spacing apart elements within a section. So if the client later says to tighten up all the spacing or increase it, we can just swap this out for tighter or looser spacing variables here, and we'll only be affecting spacing. We're not affecting other elements here. We're just choosing a different size variable that's already fluid by default. We also have variables for our section, top and bottom padding, to space apart different sections. So this is for spacing apart elements within a section. This is for spacing apart these sections themselves. We have our small, main, large, and we also have page top for when a section's at the top of the page. And we're also using these size variables for our font sizes. So under typography, the H1, H2, all of these font sizes are connected to that same size folder, which is just fluid by default. And if we look at text style here, we'll notice we have margin top and margin bottom for each heading style. So on the H2, it might be using a space from the spacing folder of 7 for the top. And then for the bottom, it might be 5. And this is inside of rich text. It's also spacing apart headings from paragraphs and different things. And this is connected to the space folder so that if we change our spacing later, it also affects the spacing around text elements. So once we have all that set, we might also want more control. So these are connected to just the general fluid sizes for now. But if we want to really dial in what this variable is doing on desktop and mobile, all we would need to do is copy its variable name and then head to the Fluid Builder. And we can select any variable here to make it fluid. And I'll just go ahead and rename this variable to be the variable name that we just copied over. So this is our spacing, section space, page top. And then we can dial in what we want this to do on both desktop and mobile. So if we check out all of our section spacings, there's a component that's directly connected to this. So it's called global section space. So if I were to add this component in, we'll notice that it's just a div that has a height and it's connected to a variant. So if I use even, it's the same as the left and right sort of site margin. If I use small, it's the small section space variable that we looked at. Main is our main one, large, and then page top is for when we're using a section at the top of the page, like so. And these are all connected to just variants. So if we were to add another section space later, we would just create a new variant and then connect it to the variable that we have here. Now, in this case, I'm going to make sure that I have section space large. And this spacer div, what it allows us to do is connect the top and bottom space for each section independently to component fields. So for each component, we can control what its top space should be and what its bottom space should be. In this case, I have the top space set to page top, but it's still going underneath that nav. So I'll go ahead and edit my page top to increase that more till I feel like the spacing feels good here. And then I'll also check out what it's doing here on mobile. And I might want to, this heading is kind of going underneath the nav. So I might increase that top space a little bit just to make sure it looks good across every breakpoint. And that's my fluid size here for the page top variable. So now that I have that dialed in, if I have another section here, because these are two separate colors, using the main space variable is good here. But if I had two dark sections back to back, I might want to remove the top space on this section altogether to bring the two closer together potentially. Here I have this sort of CTA section, and I might decide that its bottom space here, because it's going right against the footer, should actually be even, and I might want to make that all the way even here. And if I had this section being light, I might decide to remove the top space or decrease it. So this gives us a lot of control over how we want sections to interact with each other when using these spacer components. Now for our typography, if we head to the typography variable collection, we'll notice all of our core sizes here. If we had -3% letter spacing in Figma, that's -0.03 EM in Webflow. If we want to change that to -2%, we just rename the variable and change its value, and that'll update for every element, every heading that was using that variable, just by changing the variable in one place. We can do the same thing with its line height. If we rename it and change its value, that updates for every single element that was using that line height. Here, all of our font sizes are connected to that fluid size folder, but if we want a more custom size for any of these, we can just copy the variable name like so, and then head over to the Fluid Builder app, and we'd go ahead and add that variable in. We'll paste it in here, and once we have that set, we can go ahead and dial in exactly what we want the H1 font size to be on desktop and exactly what we want it to be on mobile. Now, if the difference between the desktop size and mobile size is too extreme, we'll get an accessibility error where the user can't double this font size when reaching max browser zoom. So we want to make sure that the difference isn't too extreme here. Also, if our max screen size and min screen size are too close together, we could get an accessibility warning where the first couple times the user zooms, the font size actually appears to decrease from an increased zoom, which isn't a great UX either. So we want to just push the max and min screen size further apart here. Now, for any spacing related variables, we don't have to worry about this. It's really just font size variables that we want to keep this in mind for. Now, once we have that set, we'll go ahead and back to our typography variables. And here we'll notice we also have the primary font family, the weights we plan to use with that family, and also the trim top and trim bottom. And if we were to upload a font to Webflow, Webflow tells us the numbers for the weights of that font. And if we were to have a secondary font, maybe for our heading here, we'd want to recreate those variables. So just like we have the primary family and its weights, we would have that secondary family and the weight for that. We'd also have the trim top and trim bottom. And what these trim variables allow us to do is have the bounding box hug the actual text element, the content. So without trim, we'll notice even though we have even space between this paragraph and button here, the paragraph feels closer to the button than it does to the heading. The top padding on our card feels larger than the bottom padding, and the top of this text isn't aligning with the top of the image. Now, as soon as we turn on trim, our spacing feels more consistent, alignment feels better, but we had to use much larger spacing values here than what we would normally use without the trim. So to use trim in Figma, all we have to do is go to Type Settings and turn the trim on. This is coming natively to CSS. It's already supported in the latest versions of Safari and Chrome with currently 62% browser support. But in the meantime, while we wait for support to improve, we can just manually choose how much we want to trim off the top and bottom of each font. Now I have a tool that can help us with this. We can upload our font and then we can choose how much we want to take off the top like so and how much to take off the bottom. Usually we want to trim to the top of the capital letter and we want to trim off the descender here like so. And then we can just copy this trim top value and just paste it in here for our right here, what we need. And the same trim top and bottom works for every single weight of this font. But if we have another font like a secondary family, it would need its own unique trim top and bottom like so. Now, once we have all of these core values set, we can head to our text style collection, and we'll notice that each of our headings here and also our paragraphs, small and large, are all inside of a mode. So instead of having separate font size, line height, letter spacing variables for every single heading level, we just have one variable here for each of those properties, and it works across all of the different modes. So here we can set our H6 sort of font size is connected to that font size variable like so. Our weight here can be connected to the primary medium, regular, or bold. Or if we had a secondary font, we could use that secondary font's weight, and we connect it to the secondary font family, and also the secondary font trim top and trim bottom if we had that here. We also have margin top and margin bottom for each heading element for whenever it's inside rich text or we want to space it apart from other elements. We have the letter spacing that we plan to use for each element. We can choose that here from our core variables like so. In text transform, we can make any of these all caps if we want, or lowercase, anything we need here. Now, once we have that set, what we'll notice is on these actual like H1 class, we've actually just applied the main font family variable here. We've applied the font weight variable, and we've applied font size here. We've applied line height and letter spacing, and that's all just one variable that works for every single heading level. For the text transform, since Webflow doesn't support that currently, we've just applied that text transform variable name under custom properties. And now all we have to do is switch our mode here, and it switches everything out like so. Now this is really nice because we only have one variable we had to work with. No accidentally choosing the wrong thing. If we have a margin bottom on our text element, that value is going to change. That one variable will change its value depending on the style we have applied. So an H4 might have a smaller margin bottom, H1 might have a larger one. And the same thing works great for our line height trim, because instead of having to have a separate block of custom code for an H1 line height or an H2 line height trim, we just have one variable and its value changes dynamically for each heading level. Now, the actual heading tags are completely cleared of any styles. They look just like a paragraph would, and that's the same way that frameworks like Tailwind work, and it helps to keep the semantics separated from the styles. Often we'll need to apply the font size to maybe a parent element, especially if we have images or icons that we want to match the font size of the text. And if we had a style applied to this tag, then each time we apply the font size to the parent, we'd also have to clear the styles from the child element, which isn't the best experience there. And also a lot of times we'll have, for accessibility, things like accordion toggles wrapped in an H3 tag, but we still want them to look like a paragraph. They just need that tag for accessibility. So instead of having to constantly clear out those styles that are on the tags, we can just keep the styles off the tags altogether, and it creates a much smoother development experience. So some other things to keep in mind is styles are also cleared from all of our unordered list here. And we'll notice that under our text elements, so ordered list and unordered list don't have the bullets, don't have the numbers in Lumos. It's completely cleared because we use these list elements for accessibility. Often a list will hold a list of cards or a list of nav links or things that shouldn't necessarily have bullets. We're just using that list for screen readers. Now, if we do need these styles, all we had to do is apply a class of uRich text to the parent of the list element. And as soon as we do that, all of the default styles come back to the tags inside that rich text element, and to the unordered list, all those styles come back when inside this rich text. So if we have long form content like a blog post, it's best to apply that uRich text class onto it so it gets all of its styles back. When we use the native column settings in Webflow, it can cause content to overflow and columns not to be consistent sizes. So even though this element has a max width, instead of it shrinking, it causes the column next to it to shrink. And what we'll notice on mobile, as soon as one element overflows, like this heading, it causes all other content in the grid to overflow. Now to fix this, we just need to make sure our columns are always set to a min of 0 pixels. And when we do that, we'll notice even if one element overflows, the rest of the content is nicely contained. Now, if we do the same thing here on desktop, we'll notice as soon as we set each column to a min of 0 pixels, that content on the side will no longer cause the column next to it to shrink. Instead, this element itself will just shrink and respect its own max width, like so. Now, this can be pretty tedious to apply with larger grids. Say we have a 12 column grid here. We're repeating that setting lots of times, and that's creating a lot of extra CSS in our site since it's repeating that 12 times here. Now, an easier way to do that is under custom properties, we can apply grid template columns. We can set it to repeat 12 times the min of 0 and the max of 1FR, and that creates a lot cleaner code for this one property here. Now, we can also use variables to speed this up. So in Lumos, we have all of our grid column settings saved in variables. So if I do a grid 4, that would create a 4-column grid like so. And say on mobile, I want to change it to a 2-column grid. I could switch that out here. And that just keeps all the columns even sizes while having this nicely saved in our sort of variable. And we can edit that up here or down at the bottom. Now, if we use our grid main variable, that's going to be the main column count of our site. So if our site was designed on a 10-column grid or a 12-column grid, it's going to use that main column count defined in our variable panel. We can also run into issues when using the native grid spans. So if I set this heading to span a few columns and this content to span some other columns like so, and then let's say we have multiple instances of this layout, and later we decide we want to change it. Because this is attached to the ID, this pink label, it's not attached to class, now we had to go back and edit each instance individually. Now we can solve this by, instead of using ID here, we can attach it to class under custom properties. So if we set a grid column start and we pass in which column we want this to start on, I'll say start on the knife column like so. And then we can set a grid column end, and we can pass in which column we want it to end on. And in this case, I'm going to say span over 3 columns, so it just fills 3 columns from its starting point. If I didn't pass this grid column start, it would just start automatically where it left off here. And for the end, I could also say end on -1, which means go all the way to the last column. I could say end on -2, and it would go to the second to last column like so. And there's also a shorthand for this. Instead of applying them separately, we can just attach grid column instead of grid column start and end. And then we just pass in our start value. I'll say start on 9. Then we use a / to separate it. And I'll say go all the way to the last column, -1. Notice how, because this is attached to class, it's affecting every instance of this layout. This is especially helpful if you're reusing layouts across multiple different types of components. Now here on this title element, I'll go ahead and remove its sort of ID style, and we'll go ahead and set a grid column. And here we just really want to set where it's going to end. So I'll say start on 1 and span over 7 columns like so. Now, on mobile, we might want to change the number of columns this is spanning over. So for this heading, I might say span all the way to -1. So it goes all the way to the end. And it's gone ahead and pushed this content into a new row. It's still starting on the knife column like it was originally. I might change that back to start on the first column. Now, one issue we'll run into here, and this isn't specific to Webflow, is that all of our gaps within our grid take up space. So we've left this as a 12-column grid on mobile, and that means if the user increases their font size, the gaps in that grid are getting larger, and eventually the gaps will just overflow and cause the content to overflow. So whenever we're using grid, we want to make sure on smaller breakpoints, we're also reducing our column count for those smaller breakpoints to make sure our gaps don't overflow. So I'll go ahead and do that right here. But the Lumos utilities help us automate this and make it a lot faster. So if we type UGrid, we'll see all of our different grid utilities. These are the different tools in our toolbox that each serve a purpose. We'll start with UGrid Desktop, and this class applies a 12-column grid using our grid main variable. And we'll go ahead to this header and let's apply a column 7 utility, and that's just going to set it to span 7 columns. And on this content, let's apply a column full utility so it spans all columns, but we'll change its starting point to be 9, and it'll go all the way to the end like so. Now, usually on mobile, we'd have to reset this back to spanning all columns again. But this parent grid here automatically changes on the next breakpoint to be a vertical flexbox. So these column settings on these children don't do anything when the parent is a flex, so they go back to being full width automatically without us having to manually change anything. Now we can choose the exact point where this wraps. We have a grid tablet utility, which keeps the 12-column grid on desktop and on tablet, but right below tablet, it'll switch to being full width. We also have a grid landscape utility. And if we have that set, it's going to stay a 12-column grid on desktop, tablet, and landscape. And then right below landscape, it'll go ahead and switch to being a full width layout again. Now we can also set a UGrid custom, and this allows us to apply a custom column count for each breakpoint. So here on desktop, I may switch it to a 2-column grid. It can stay that way on tablet, and on the next breakpoint, it might switch back to a 1-column grid. Now we can also edit our row gap for when the items stack under each other. By default, the column gap and row gap is set to our site gutter, which is the space between columns, but we can go ahead and switch that over to maybe space 6, so that when elements stack under each other, they're spaced further apart. Or another way we can do this is to use our utilities for gap row, and we'll say 6, and that way we apply the space that way. Now, another grid setting we have is to use a UGrid flex, and this allows us to have grid-like behavior, but with Flexbox. This is best for simple layouts where items don't need to span across multiple rows, since that's only possible in grid. But here we have a flex set to allow wrapping so the items can stack under each other. And on this first item here, we would actually set its size using width, and we have these column width variables. So I could set this to a column width of 6. We also have margin variables. So if I want to give this some left margin, I could use a column margin of maybe 2 or 3, however far I want to push it over. This column margin is different from column width because column width doesn't account for that gutter. Notice how it's just aligned to the end of the column itself, whereas the column margin actually accounts for that gutter and allows us to put it on the start of a column. Now, in this case, I'm just going to use a column width, and I'll go ahead and change that to 7. And then on this content here, I'll go ahead and set a column width, and we'll do something like maybe 4. And we can use space between if needed to push these apart like so. And then on the next breakpoint, we might want to change this header to be maybe a 12-column grid. And then we might switch this content over to spanning a couple more columns like so. This next utility I don't use too often, but it can be helpful in some more advanced cases, and that's UGrid subgrid. This allows us to create a child grid that's based on a parent grid. So our parent element here is a 12-column grid, and then this child grid, we can set it to start on a certain column just like we would in any element. So I'll say start on the second column and end on the second to last column, so -2, like so. And now it's created a 10-column grid within the parent 12-column grid. So here on this title element, I could apply a column full, so it spans all columns. On this content, I'll also apply column full, but I'll offset the start to start on the 4th column like so. So if I were to change how many columns this subgrid is spanning over, like maybe we say start on 3 and span to -3, we'll notice that this has now become an 8-column grid within the 12-column grid. because it's completely based on the parent element like so. Now this next grid is helpful when we want an element to go all the way to the edge of the screen. Now to do this, we'll need to move our layout outside our container and delete the container. Now on the layout, we'll add a U grid breakout. And what this sets is a 14 column grid. So this first large space is our first column. We have our 12 inner columns and then another large space for our last column. And what we can do is on this content, we'll go ahead and set a grid column start, and we'll say start on the content region, and we'll do a grid column end, and we'll say end on the content region. So that stays within the container. It goes from edge to edge of that container. And then for this visual, we'll go ahead and do a grid column start. And we could make this start on the full region if we want, which is all the way on the end of the screen. And we can do grid column end, and we could say end on the content region, or however far we want this to go. In this case, I'll make it end on full, so it's going edge to edge. Now for this content, I'll change this end here to say span 6. And then we want this visual to pick up where it left off, so on 7. But because this first space counts as a column, we'll actually say start 8. And that should make it start in exactly the right place. So now we have an image that's breaking off all the way to the edge of the screen. And on our next breakpoint here, we might change some things and make this content going back to end on content again. And maybe this visual here can start on content, and we'll keep it ending on full. So it continues to break out all the way down here. And on our very last breakpoint, this breakout grid is going to change to a 3-column grid with this left space being the first column. This middle 12 columns becomes one large column. And then we have our other column on the end just to make sure our gaps don't cause any overflow. This next grid class is the most important and powerful grid class we have in Lumos, and that's UGrid AutoFit. AutoFit creates automatically responsive layouts. Here we define the minimum size we want our columns to get, in this case never smaller than 13 rem, and they'll automatically reduce our column count before the columns get smaller than that 13 rem. So this isn't tied at all to breakpoints, which is great for accessibility because if the user increases their font size, the layout will eventually wrap. If we were using a breakpoint grid, then it would stay stuck at a 4-column grid even when the user makes their font size larger and the text would overflow. But because we're using AutoFit here, we can see what our mobile design looks like even if we've never left the desktop breakpoint. In my previous tutorial, I created an entire lander without applying a single style to the tablet or mobile breakpoints, all thanks to AutoFit Grid. Now, what if we want this to be a 2-column grid here on desktop? Well, we would just check this from our max container size, and we'd go ahead and update the minimum size of our columns so it can only fit 2 columns per row. So if we try 23, it looks like that's fitting about 3 columns. If we try 28, it's going to start off now as a 2-column grid, and it'll just wrap from that point on down when it needs to wrap. With our AutoFit grid, if we delete a card, the remaining cards will just take up whatever space is left. In fact, if we only have 1 card here, it's taking up all that space. This is great in most cases, but if this is a grid that we're filtering out, we might not want the card size to change when we have less cards. So we can go ahead and use an alternative, which is grid autofill. This does the opposite of what you might think. It fills in the grid with some empty columns. So if we go ahead and duplicate this here, we'll notice this grid can hold up to 5 items. I'll go ahead and change that minimum column size here, and we'll say maybe something like 16. And so now we can hold up to 4 cards here, but if we have less than that, the cards don't fill the remaining space. Now, this is still automatically responsive like so it's going to wrap when it needs to wrap, but this is good in some cases where we don't want the cards to grow. Here we have a regular 2-column grid, and what we'll notice is even on our desktop breakpoint, this link is starting to overflow out of its parent like so. We could add an extra large desktop breakpoint, or we could reduce the font size a little. Neither of those are good solutions though, because even on our original screen size, if the user increases their font size enough, it'll eventually have that same overflow issue we were running into before. So what we want to do instead is use AutoFit Grid, and once we apply that, we can set what we want our minimum column size to be. In this case, I never want these columns to get smaller than 19 rem. That leaves a little bit of space on the side of that link. So I just select my entire AutoFit Grid and give it a minimum column size of 19 rem. So those links are still stacked side by side, but when we run out of space, they'll eventually just wrap under each other like so. And their parent is even an auto-fit grid here that's holding these two columns together. And that means this entire layout is responsive right from our desktop breakpoint. If the user increases their font size, it'll eventually wrap just like it would if this was a mobile design here. So before we run out of space for this link here, we'll notice it actually stacks underneath the logo, and now everything is completely wrapped. Here's a common Flexbox pattern we may need to apply. So we might have elements stacking side by side, aligned to the bottom, and we space them between. And we also allow wrapping so the buttons can stack under the heading. Now, when they do wrap, notice how our row is set to stretch. So this heading is in the middle. Usually we want the row alignment to match our main alignment. So if this was set to center, then when it wraps, we want it to stay aligned to the center. And that's exactly what the Flex classes allow us to do in an easy way. So here we might go ahead and set an H flex, which is a horizontal flex for elements side by side. We could also use a V flex if we want elements to stack under each other. Now for our H flex, the first word is going to be how elements align from left to right, so on the X axis. And the second word is how it aligns from top to bottom, so on the Y axis. So here we want them to space between on X, and then on Y we want to align them to the bottom like so. And a faster way we can do that is just use the first letter. So horizontal, between, and bottom like so. And then we have that set here. Now, if we go ahead and turn on wrapping, notice how this row alignment matches our main alignment, and that's coming from this class here. If I were to go ahead and replace this with center like so, we'll notice again, it completely matches here for when things wrap under each other. And we could also use a vertical flex if needed. And for this V flex, I'll still align to the left here on X, and then we'll align between on Y. So we space them apart like so. And so these flex classes cover the majority of everything we need to do with Flexbox. Here we have this layout set to grow if possible, so that way it fills all the space of the container. But we could also do that with a utility. We have flex grow and flex shrink or no shrink. So in this case, I'll just apply grow and it fills all that space. We also have flex order utilities. If I want to move this to the last position in the list, I could just throw in an order last. And those order utilities also work inside of grid if needed. So the majority of everything we need can be done with these utilities. Now to put this into practice, let's build out a section. So we'll call this section our hero main wrap. And inside of that, we'll add a section space. I'll duplicate that, and in between it, we'll add a div with the class of contain, and we'll add our container class on top. Now inside that, we'll add a layout, and we'll give this an auto-fit class. And inside that layout, let's add a div with the class of content, and in that, we'll have our heading. So I'm going to hit the up arrow key to jump to the last item in the list, and we can add our global heading component. This has some default styles for us, and we'll add in our global paragraph within that. And under that, we'll go ahead and add our global button group, which can hold buttons together. And inside that, we'll add the main button. We'll duplicate it, and I'll change out this one to say secondary. We'll go ahead and change its text to say get started today. And we can go ahead and check out this component. So in this component, it actually has a class of uButtonGroup, which is our utility that says the main gap we want between all our buttons and the main top margin and all of that. But we can override this using different utilities if we want. So if we want this instance of the component to have more gap, or we want it to have more top margin, we can do MT for margin top, MB for margin bottom, and we can apply those utilities to override its default style. Same for this heading, we might want to switch this to an H3 sort of style here, and instead of using the default margin bottom we want for all H3s, we might decide to tighten this up a little bit, like so. And here we have this sort of paragraph here. We might switch this to our text style of small, and we might decide to loosen up the max width. We can go max width 60 ch instead. This rich text class allows us to have dynamic styling. So if I had another line of text here, or I could add bullets or anything like that, it still works with my text sizes. But if I took this rich text off, it wouldn't have all of that dynamic styling we want inside. So that class is on the paragraphs by default. So we can have bullets and different things like that if we need. Now we're also going to check out if we go ahead and add in sort of a div inside this layout, we might have a div for our visual. I could call this hero main visual. And usually I add a U visual wrap utility on that so that it has a default aspect ratio. We could, of course, override that. It has a position of relative and overflow hidden. And inside that, we usually add sort of our global visual, which is just a position absolute image or video to cover the space. I'll go ahead and choose kind of this image here. And if we want to adjust the cropping of this, we can set its position from the left of the screen like so. And we can also offset its position from top and bottom to kind of align that. So this is one way we can handle it. And using this custom class here for our component allows us to override the styles, maybe across breakpoints if we need, and just gives us a little bit more control. We might decide to add a radius main sort of utility to round off the corners there. But we don't have to use this div if we don't want it. So this div gives us more custom control, but if we'd rather just use the component directly, we can remove the position absolute from this and then add on a ratio utility. In this case, I'll say, let's do 3x2. And let's add on our radius. We'll go ahead and say radius main, and we can use this component directly if needed. I'm also going to use this component within the entire section. So I'll add in that global visual, and because it's position absolute, it's just covering everything. And I'll use it as a background image to the section this time. So I'll choose this image here, and then we can turn on this overlay that covers everything. We can choose the opacity of how dark we want the overlay to be, depending on the brightness of the image itself. And then because this section has a background image, I'm going to make sure it's always in dark mode. So I'll give it a UTheme dark class like so. And so we can get some pretty good control from this. Within this, we can also make sure we can use a background video. If we add the URL here, we can choose if the video loops or autoplays or is muted. And by default, the video is not visible, so it's actually not rendered on the published site at all. And for this image, if this is the hero section, it's the first one on our page, we want to set the loading to eager, and that helps with our page speed score. So we do that for both of these components here. And before the image actually loads in, we have sort of this background color, and this is like applied to the whole component. It's just a skeleton sort of loader so that the space doesn't look empty while the image is still loading in. Now here we have, we might want to align this to the center, this content. And if we apply flex here, notice how it feels like there's more space between the button and paragraph when we turn flex on. And the reason for that is because this paragraph has some default bottom margin to separate it from other elements we might have. The button group has some default top margin, and those margins overlap each other whenever they're not inside of a Flexbox. But whenever we turn the parent to flex or grid, margins no longer overlap. So anywhere we're using anywhere we're using margins, we don't want to use a flex or grid parent. Instead, we just align the whole child to center. Now this is applied to the ID with this pink label. We want it applied to class. So we'll do an align self of center, and we have all these utilities of how we can align this element vertically. And now we've aligned this to the center without applying flex to the direct parent like so. Now let's try creating our own global component, and this will be to store the ratings, like how many stars this company has. So we'll say global rating wrap, and we'll go ahead and add a text block in here, and we'll say global rating text, and we might say something like this is 4.9 out of 5 stars, and we'll say ratings as a whole or something. And we have this text here. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and copy this SVG. So from Figma, we'll copy as SVG. And then in here, we'll go ahead and launch the SVG import app. And I'll just paste this in. And that allows us to control the SVG with our font color and affect the individual paths within the SVG if we need, which is great. So I'll go ahead and give this a class of global rating SVG. We'll give it sort of a size here like so. And then we want these to kind of stack side by side. We also want a gap between them, and we want to allow wrapping so they can stack under each other when needed. Now here, if this global component is inside of a centered aligned section, we actually want to change it to center. If it's left aligned, we want it at left. Now the way we can do this is we actually have in our variables an alignment mode. And this has an alignment variable for flex alignment and for text alignment. So if we switch the mode on the whole section to center per se, all children that are using these alignment variables will respect that parent. So this gives us a tremendous amount of control when we're using especially global components that we can't really control. So what we can do here is I'll go ahead and remove all of the flex settings we just applied. And instead, we're going to use an alignment utility. And so we have an alignment horizontal if we want elements side by side, vertical if we want them under each other. So I'll do horizontal here. That puts the elements side by side. And you notice I can adjust if it's aligned to the top, center, or bottom. But the left and right alignment is connected to a variable right here that we can use individually. So what that means is on this whole section, if I go ahead and switch the alignment mode and I switch that over to, let's say, center, notice how this child moved to the center. Now you notice some other elements moved to the center as well. And one of those elements was this text. And that's because this text is using a U child contain, which keeps that child contained within its parent. If I didn't have that applied, you'll notice that the parent is now having this max width. But if I add U child contain back on, the parent is full width and the child inside is being contained. And if we just want to take a look at what that utility does, U child contain. So it's going to make the child have a max width, and I'll just drop in a paragraph element. And it'll make this parent have 100% min width. So it's always filling its full parent, but the child inside is the element that's actually contained. And one other thing we'll notice is this U child contain has a flex, and that flex is linked to our same alignment utility. So all of these headings that have a max width, paragraphs that have a max width, they're going to respect the alignment of the entire section when we switch this over, as long as they have that U child contain class that's keeping them contained. Now, one other thing you'll notice is when I switch the alignment of the whole section over to center is that the text alignment isn't actually center here. And to do that, we just need to make sure we're applying also our alignment variable to something. So our text alignment here, we can go ahead and copy that variable name. And I'll do that right here, copy as CSS. And if we go ahead and say text align, and I say paste in that text alignment variable, now we've applied text alignment to the whole center, and that text alignment will either be left or center or right, depending on what our alignment variable does. Now, instead of having to apply this alignment mode manually and apply this text alignment manually, we can actually just add on an alignment utility and align everything to the center, left, or right. And when we apply that, it automatically applies the text align, it automatically applies the alignment mode. All that is set on the class. And for this component, I'll go ahead and turn this into a global component. So all of our global components are inside the global folder. I'll call this our global, we'll call this rating, and we'll go ahead and put this in that global folder like so. And what I'll do is I'll attach a class attribute to this, and I'll give this some margin bottom. So I'll do MB and let's say maybe 4 by default, and I'll link this up to a component field. And I just need to include the word class somewhere in this field name. So now on this whole component, every time we use it, it's going to have this default margin bottom 4. If we ever want to change that margin globally, we just need to edit the default for this prop. But if we need to take that margin off for some reason, maybe we're using Flexbox for the parent, or in some cases we want to override that margin, we still have that control to do that from this component field as needed. Now, something else we may notice if we decide to hide this button group in some instances of the component is that because this paragraph has some default bottom margin, we're seeing this extra space here. Now to fix that, there's a utility called uMarginTrim we can apply to this parent element, and it'll remove the bottom margin from the last visible child, and it'll remove the top margin from the first visible child. And so that way we never have to worry about this margin causing unwanted space for any of the children. Once we're finished, we'll select the entire section and we'll turn this into a component. We want it to go in our section folder. So I'll call this section/hero/main and create, and let's actually put it within those sections like so. And the reason we name it this way, so is if we search section/, it'll show all the sections we can use to build a page. If I search hero, it'll show the different types of hero sections I have throughout the site. So this creates a nice system for finding the exact section we need. Also, if we look at our components, we have the section full and section simple. These components are never meant to be used directly. We just use them as a starting point. They have this bullet point in front of them so that they're always at the top and they don't get lost. So if I wanted to create a new component from this, I would just duplicate it, and I would call this maybe my section CTA main, if this is my main CTA section, and I'm removing that bullet point from the start of it. I'd create it, and once I have this new component, I can now add it to the page. And the benefit here is it already has all of these component fields. So instead of having to recreate all of these fields from scratch and link everything up to fields, we can just start building this component. We can start giving it a class like CTA main wrap on all of the children. We would start applying classes, and we can go ahead and delete the elements we don't need. Like if I don't need the eyebrow for the CTA component, or I don't need an image for this component, I would just delete that, and I would go to props on the whole section and remove the component fields of the elements I'm not needing. Whenever we duplicate a component, it puts the styles at the bottom for some reason, but I like to keep styles at the top and theme as the first option within that. And once we have that set, we have this component we can use to continue building things out. That's pretty much all of our different sections components. We've covered our button components. We've covered some of our different global components like our button group. If you'd like to learn more about any of these components, the Lumos Docs covers them all in depth, but these are some of the core components we can use here. This global section is just a generic section we can use if we want to create something in build mode. Let's say that we don't have a section design for a particular thing we're trying to achieve. We can just drop in this global generic section here. We can change its container. Let's use container small in this case. We can change its padding top and padding bottom by default. We can set its theme, and then we can just start dropping things inside that we need, like our heading, and we can drop in our paragraph. If we want a div that's going to hold this content, we have a global div component, and this is just a div that we can use inside of build mode. So I could drop in the heading and paragraph in here. I might go ahead and drop in the button group in here, and we can start applying styles to this div and build out a pretty robust section just with these global components if needed. That's only a fallback approach. The recommended approach is to give every section a custom sort of component name and custom class names as much as possible, because it makes the site really maintainable in the long run. We covered our global visual, and then these icons, anywhere we're using icons throughout the site, we just want to save them in a component, so that way we can reuse that icon, and if we ever need to change it, we just edit that component. It'll replace everywhere that icon is being used. Another thing that's helpful to have on these icons, if I check this out, is we actually on the path have a vector effect non-scaling stroke. And what that means is without this attribute set on this path, the stroke wouldn't actually match our border widths. So this is connected to our border width variable. And that way, when we have this vector effect non-scaling stroke, if I make this icon much smaller, like I'll go ahead and wrap it in a div. Let's bring it outside of the page wrap for a second, and then wrap this in a div. And let's say this is we'll go ahead and call it our hero SVG. And that's another thing, is we always want to apply a width and height to the actual parent div. That way the icon itself can be used at multiple sizes. Same thing, we would apply the color to the actual parent div itself. And that way the global icon can be used in multiple colors like so. And so we have that set. Notice how when I'm changing the width of this parent, the stroke width of the icon is always consistent. It's staying at 2 pixels. It would get really, really large if we weren't using that vector effect non-scaling stroke. The stroke would be getting thicker as we make the icon larger, which isn't what we want. So this just keeps it really consistent. So whenever we add in an icon, we just add in this global SVG class that applies some styles we need on that SVG, and then we turn it into a reusable component that we can have anywhere. Another thing we've covered all of our custom code fluid sizes and grid guide component, but we also have these starter CSS and JS components, and that's for when we need to store custom code inside of a section. We would add in that starter CSS component here, and we'd unlink it, and then we'd go ahead and add in any custom code that's related just to this one section. So that way, when the client adds this section onto their page, the custom code that belongs with this section comes along with it. And we're not storing a bunch of unneeded custom code in our global embed that's only going to be used for certain sections. So that's an overview of some of the default Lumos components and how to set them up. I hope this tutorial gives you a good base understanding of how to use Lumos in your projects.